Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video that I thought would be very particularly interesting. And of course, this is going to be a video, I believe, by that of Ring Magazine. I was going to do a video about this subject, anyways, but I thought overall that this would be the perfect video to review because this is going to be a little bit nostalgic for someone like me. I had a live stream, I believe, as of yesterday, where I believe I debated a man by the name of Q, or whatever his name was, and he debated me overall about who actually has the better resume, or that resume that it's not quite as important, overall as what someone can do in the ring. And it depends on the type of factors that we're talking about. Of course, resume isn't always going to win you a fight. I've seen fighters to where they have a better resume and they end up losing that of the big fight. But that being stated, resume definitely is going to help you a lot in terms of the greatness category. It is going to help you in terms of the pound per pound list, and it is going to help you in terms of how great you are going to be remembered. And when we talk about both that of a Saul Canelo Alvarez and a Terrence Bud Crawford with their mega fight this up and coming Saturday, they're both looked at as all-time great level fighters. But Terrence Bud Crawford, the reason why his resume has been criticized to a certain degree is because his resume just does not have the vast amount of A grade level names that Canelo Alvarez has. It just is what it is. And in my personal view, I've always stated this. Canelo, in my view, has about 11 A grade level names debatably on his resume. You can state that there's less if you wanted to, but in my view, it's about 11. As for Crawford, the most amount of A grade level names that you can really claim on there is 5. That's really about it. And people are going to remember that. It just is what it is. Which is why I say that their legacy at the current moment in time, or at least their resume, when we talk about their comparisons, Terrence Bud Crawford, as I stated in my live stream, is very similar to some fighters like that of a Rocky Marciano, a Salvador Sanchez, and also that of a Joe Calzaghe. Toro, when you take a look at those fighters, peak v peak versus almost any fighter of their respective weight classes, you wouldn't really expect many people to beat them. There are certain fighters, including that of a Floyd Mayweather and a Roy Jones Jr., that will tell you that Salvador Sanchez is hands down the most skilled Mexican fighter of all time. But there's very few people to this day that actually debate that Salvador Sanchez is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. And it's not that he couldn't be debated there in terms of skill set. The problem is that his career was just too vastly short. And I understand overall what people are trying to say, but there's a reason overall why Terrence Bud Crawford, in my view, belongs within those realms because his resume is just not as long. Terrence Bud Crawford has one of the highest peak levels that I've ever personally seen for a boxer. He's a lot like Khabib Nurmagomedov in the UFC, or like I stated, Rocky Marciano, Salvador Sanchez, or Joe Calzaghe. There's very few people that you would pick to actually beat those guys, and they would probably beat about 90% of the guys that they would ever face in their respective weight divisions or of around their natural size. But that being stated, we can never completely go off of that because that is a little bit of a hypothetical. And the point is that, say for example, because I believe that the man, overall in my debate, or in my live stream, he stated, well, I don't think that Crawford, overall would lose to a lot of those welterweights that you might put over him. And I mean, that's a point that maybe you can put out there if you really want to. But the point is that, overall, the reason why, at least in my personal view, why we have to go off of results and not overall just what someone can do in the ring is because how many times have we seen an all-time greatly skilled level fighter, someone like a Mike Tyson, where it looks like they're going to be the real deal and they're beating up a lot of these guys in the heavyweight division, but then they fight legitimate A-grade level fighters and they pretty much lose every single time they get in the ring with them. Like Evander Holyfield. If Mike Tyson's career would have ended probably before the Buster Douglas fight, you'd have people legitimately debating that Mike Tyson is the greatest fighter of all time. You would have, I mean, there's still people that debate that Mike Tyson is the greatest fighter of all time, even after some of the ass whoopings that he suffered. But the point is this: you can never claim that, overall, because you don't know what would have happened had he fought some of the other bigger names. And the truth is that although I would have favored Crawford more than likely over a peak Keith Thurman or a peak Kell Brook or a peak Danny Garcia or some of those other guys, or possibly even over some other peak fighters like a Roberto Duran or Sugar Ray Leonard, possibly. Who knows? Maybe he could have even beaten them. But the point is that we will never know that for sure. So the point is that I can't go off of that. I have to go off of your accomplishments. I have to go off of your skill set. And I also have to go off of your resume. And the resume in terms of boxing is the most important thing that any boxer can have, because that proves how many A grade level names that you beat in your career. And that's why Canelo Alvarez at times is held, at least in terms of his resume, in a higher regard. And when I take a look at Canelo Alvarez's career and also his resume, his career, in my view, is more comparable to that of a Sugar Ray Leonard's, or that also of, a Roberto Duran's or a Chavez's, certain guys like that. Crawford, in terms of his resume, it's not quite up there. Now, I understand the narrative of, overall, well, we should go off of what they can do, instead of their resume, but we have to go off of the full package. What they can do is great, but, and we're going to get into this here in a few minutes, but I've seen many, many athletes be ranked overall in certain areas to where they probably shouldn't have been because of quote unquote what they can do. And I've always been known for stating this. Anyone that has been around my channel long enough overall knows this quote from me. There's so many people that take a look at the talent of somebody and what they can do that they don't actually take a look at what they actually did. And I've seen this overall with certain athletes like Aaron Rodgers, Anthony Davis, certain guys like that, and of course, people are not completely innocent of it either in terms of that of boxing. How many times have we seen a fighter that allegedly was supposed to be the next Floyd Mayweather, was supposed to be the next heavyweight king, was supposed to be this, was supposed to be that, and then they finally got in the ring with an A grade level fighter and they lost. So the point overall is that, we can go off of that all we want to, but the point is that if they don't have the list of names or the resume, how can we ever completely state that? How can we 100% state overall that, say, for example, had Adrian Broner had his career ended before he fought someone like a Marcos Maidana, that he would have beaten guys overall like, say, a Miguel Cotto or a Zab Judah, or a Sugar Shane Mosley or certain things like that. Had Adrian Broner retired at that day, he would have been remembered as a undefeated 4-weight division champion. But then when he stepped in the ring with legit A-grade level fighters, he lost every single one of them. So the point is that although Crawford is a very proven fighter, he is someone that, in my view, is an all-time great level fighter. He's someone that isn't super far off from the Canelo or Sugar Ray Leonard or those guys' levels. But the point is that his resume, it's just not as impressive as theirs. It just is what it is. And in terms of boxing, that is hands down going to be the most important category, because we can never know if you're going to beat some of those level fighters, even if I would have favored you over some of those fighters, just in my personal view. But we'll talk about that as well, because he brought up some great points about, who, what overall is an A grade level fighter, what is a B grade level fighter. And he brought up a point that I thought was very particularly interesting, that are we just ranking Canelo Alvarez's opponents as more A grade than Terence Crawford because Canelo is more popular? And in my personal view, no. Now, at times that can happen, but the point is that fans and a lot of people know when someone is usually fighting an A grade level fighter. For example, there's not one person that will claim that Gervonta Tank Davis, who is pretty much the king of American pay-per-view right now, there's not one person that'll tell you that he has a better resume than that overall of a Terence Bud Crawford or a Devin Haney. Not unless you're Boxing Eagle or a major Gervonta Tank Davis fan. So the point is that I understand what he's getting at, but no, when we take a look at Canelo's career, he does have a legit, resume. He's someone that has a very extensive resume. But that being stated, we're going to go over Canelo Alvarez's resume throughout this video, and I thought that it was very particularly interesting. But this is going to be very nostalgic for me, as I'm sure it will be for some of you, but especially for me because I grew up watching both Canelo Alvarez and Terence Bud Crawford. And I remember watching Canelo Alvarez, a lot throughout my youth, or at least watching him during my teenage years, and I absolutely hated Canelo Alvarez. I could not stand this dude. The first fight that I ever seen Canelo Alvarez in was against Lara. The first couple of times that I watched it when I was younger, I thought that Lara had gotten robbed. And I think the reason why was because, first of all, I didn't know how to quite consistently score a boxing fight as much as what I do now. But taking a look at that fight, it was a fight that could have went either way. And Canelo was the golden boy, so Lara was just going to have to do more to win that fight. And you can debate that Canelo won the fight. He put on a lot of pressure. He was someone overall that ended the fight stronger. It just is what it is. But the point is, overall is that, I remember hating Canelo Alvarez for a very long time. And by around the Triple G fights, I was hoping that Triple G was going to break this dude's neck. Like, I was really hoping that he was going to end Canelo Alvarez's career, because I really could not stand this dude. And I think that a lot of people overall that that they don't know that overall about me enough. Probably I've explained it in the past, but I'm someone, of course, who grew to respect Canelo Alvarez and love watching Canelo Alvarez as a fighter, of course, as I grew older. But that's what ends up happening when you end up maturing as a person and become more logical and a little bit more objective. You know how to appreciate greatness. And there's certain people, of course, that will, tell you this stuff about how Canelo's career is a facade and all sort of stuff. But no, I've watched Canelo Alvarez. I did not favor him to beat Gennady Golovkin. In fact, when he first moved up to 160, at the time, I think I would have been like 17 or something like that. I don't even remember favoring him over that of a David Lemieux. Had he were to fight a David Lemieux, or had he had fought a David Lemieux. But I had completely hated Canelo Alvarez back then. But anyways, the point is overall is that Crawford of course came around that time as well. A couple of years later, I believe he fought Yuriorkis Gamboa, or maybe about a year later, and of course then he came on the scene. But Terrence Bud Crawford and Canelo Alvarez, they're two fighters that I've definitely grown to love to watch. They're two of the best fighters that I've ever seen. They're two all-time great level fighters, and this fight will somewhat determine, in my view, where they're ranked within the history of boxing. But that being stated, let's get into it. Let's take a look at Canelo Alvarez's resume, and let's talk about some of the opponents that he has defeated and who, in my view, I would count as A-grade level fighters and who I would not count. Because, of course, what another narrative is that Canelo fought a lot of quote-unquote big names, but he fought them at a weaker point in their career. I mean, you can debate that some names, in my view, were not necessarily at their absolute peak, but a lot of them were at an A-grade point. But we're going to talk about that as the video goes along. But let's get into it. I'm sure it'll be very nostalgic for some of you, as well as it's going to be for me, because I'm going to remember every single one of these fights. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what these gentlemen have to say.
In modern boxing, few names resonate louder than Saul Canelo Alvarez. From his humble beginnings in Guadalajara to becoming the face of the sport, his career has been defined by ambition, risk, and the relentless pursuit of greatness.
What a performance by Canelo Alvarez. Maybe all things considered, the most electrifying of Canelo Alvarez's career.
There, of course, was his fight against former Puerto Rican welterweight champion, I believe, Kermit Cintrón. Of course, for those of you that remember Kermit Cintrón was one of the more highly touted Puerto Rican fighters, I believe, of the early to mid 2000s. I believe that he was either a 1 or 2-time champion. Of course, he was mainly known for losing to that of Antonio Margarito. Now, of course, Antonio Margarito, in my personal view, was a massive, massive cheater. He was someone that more than likely was packing, overall, and then that's pun completely intended. He was more than likely packing overall with those hand wraps and those gloves, for a while. That being stated, Kermit Cintrón was someone that was a bit shinny. He was someone that overall was known for tiring out a little bit later on in fights. That also being stated, let me state this. What I will state is this. Many people, when they take a look at Canelo's resume, or they state that it, has a little bit more flair than what it actually deserves, they're mainly taking a look at his fights against guys like Carlos Baldomir and Kermit Cintrón and Shane Mosley. When Canelo fought those guys, they were no longer A-grade level fighters, in my view. They were a little bit more wore down, and they were kind of just, more to gain experience for Canelo, because boxing had plans for Canelo. They knew that he was up next, so that pretty much was very early on to give him experience. Now, of course, he was supposed to have a couple of other fights that would have been very interesting. He was supposed to have a fight against Victor Ortiz, but that didn't happen because Ortiz fucked that fight up against Josesito Lopez, got his jaw broken. And of course, he was also supposed to have a fight against Paul Williams, but unfortunately, I think Paul Williams, that was when he had his career-ending accident where he got paralyzed. That would have been a very interesting fight. Paul Williams was someone that, he oftentimes gets mentioned a lot by certain fans, but he was someone that, in my view, was a little bit overrated. He was more of a weight bully, in my personal view. And once he really started to move up the weight classes, he kind of showed how limited he actually was. He was someone that was talented, but he was someone that was a bit sloppy, overall. Wasn't someone that, in my view, was as sharp as, say, someone like a Canelo. It would have been interesting, but I think Canelo more than likely would have dominated him. A fight that I would have loved to have seen, however, that I never got to see, and it would have never possibly happened, would have been Canelo versus Sergio Martinez. That would have been a fight that, in my view, would have been a dynamite fight. I would have loved to have seen that.
Across 2 decades, he has conquered 4 weight divisions, unified entire championships, and shared the ring with legends.
And now the hatred, the enmity forgotten.
Upon each showing,
Gennady Golovkin, just to talk about it, because I believe in my live stream, I believe that Q mentioned that, well, how many all-time great level fighters has Canelo really been in the ring with? Well, I mean, you can debate this about a lot of fighters. I mean, because how many all-time great fighters has Crawford really been in the ring with? I mean, the only one that you can even debate, in my view, that's even close to an all-time great level fighter that he fought is that of what's his name, Errol Spence. And I don't know if I would call Errol Spence an all-time great. I would call him a great, but not someone that's an all-time great in my view. But I mean, that's kind of up to you. That's up to the eye of the beholder. But the point overall is that, you know, Canelo Alvarez, when you do take a look at all-time greats, Golovkin was an all-time great level fighter. He's not someone that has the most extensive resume, but he did defeat Danny Jacobs when Jacobs was an A-grade level fighter. He also defeated David Lemieux when you can either label him as an A- or B+ level fighter. David Lemieux, in my view, was really more B+, but I mean, you know, it is what it is. But Golovkin still was beating the shit out of those boys at 160. And of course, he had that first fight against Canelo where, in my personal view, you know, it probably, it probably should have just slightly went to him. But anyway, not to mention Gennady Golovkin has like the most amount of middleweight title defenses of all time.
He's evolved into a fighter whose blend of skill, resilience, and star power has made him boxing's premier attraction.
He has never been hit by a guy with this kind of power.
Now, with his legacy firmly secured and history already written, Canelo steps into yet another monumental challenge. This time,
Well, his story is already somewhat written. He's always going to be, both of these fighters are always going to be remembered as all-time greats no matter what happens. But that being stated, whoever does lose this fight, there is going to be a lot of criticism around them. It just is what it is. Canelo Alvarez, he will then be remembered on the levels of Oscar De La Hoya and Cotto if he loses this fight, you know, because right now I have him about a level or two above those guys. And if he ends up winning this fight, then it'll be, you know, pretty much exactly on the same level as guys like Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard. If Crawford wins this fight, then he'll definitely be on the same level as a Duran or a Leonard, if not even slightly over them. You know, because then he'll be undefeated and 3 times undisputed and, you know, yada, 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 yada. You know, but anyways, but if he loses this fight, then one could debate that maybe he's not quite on the same level as that of a Sugar Ray Leonard or Duran. Now, someone, you know, did mention a good point. They said, well, what if he makes this fight close? What would you state then? And that's a great point, because it's not like Duran or Leonard always won, you know, every single fight in their career. But that being stated, the problem is that, you know, Canelo and Duran and Leonard, they already beat guys that were clearly bigger than them that were A grade. I don't know if Crawford's ever really done that. And that's also another thing why I take a look at Crawford. And don't get it twisted, he's an all-time great level fighter. But if he does end up losing this fight, in my view, I just don't know if I can kind of put him in the same class as guys like that of a Leonard or Duran. He would be more, in my view, within the same realm as guys like Bernard Hopkins or Tommy Hearns. Like guys overall that were great fighters, but someone that really didn't beat any legit A-grade level fighters, in my view, that were actually bigger than them. And I know that certain people will say, what are you talking about? Bernard Hopkins and Tommy Hearns, they moved up weight classes, right? But give me a break. Tommy Hearns has what, a 78-inch reach? He's 6'1". He's damn near the same height and reach as Muhammad Ali. He's not a natural 147-pounder. You're like a 160-pounder at a minimum, dude. So, I mean, the point is that, you know, when he was moving up to, you know, to weight classes like even super middleweight and light heavyweight, it's like, you know, to be quite honest with you, although he still was probably a bit outsized there, he definitely would have fit there a lot better than most fighters. Like, he wasn't the same size as Sugar Ray Leonard or the same size as Roberto Duran. Like, get out of here. He was way bigger than them. You know, and then when we take a look at Crawford, he is someone that is an all-time great level fighter, but he was always eventually going to kind of mold at 147. He was someone overall that could fit at 135 and 144 a while, but, you know, he's never really fought fighters, in my view, that have been legitimately bigger than him. Unlike Leonard, unlike Duran, unlike that of Canelo.
against Terence Crawford,
Or at least decently bigger than him. Let me state that.
fellow pound-for-pound great. It's the latest chapter in a career that's continually pushed boundaries and one that promises to shape how his legacy will ultimately be remembered. Welcome to the career story of Saul Canelo Alvarez. Saul Alvarez was born in Guadalajara, Mexico, the youngest of 8 children, 7 of them boys who would all go on to become professional boxers.
You know, the Mexicans overall, my Mexican friends always tell me that, you know, overall in a big Mexican family, there's always at least one white boy or one Caucasian. Apparently, Canelo Alvarez was that Caucasian.
Saul, however, was the most unique. A red-haired Mexican child nicknamed Canelo, he became an easy target for bullying. And when he started fighting back, his natural gift with his fists became clear.
Canelo looks like overall as a kid the male version of Little Debbie. Or the girl from Wendy's.
In a nation where fighters are bred tough and early, Canelo turned professional at just 15.
El Canelo Alvarez.
Over the next 4 years, he built an astonishing undefeated 31-fight record, capturing the imagination of Mexican fans who believed they were witnessing their nation's next great champion.
Alvarez, a budding star in Mexico.
You know, I remember when Floyd Mayweather Jr. at one point in time, I believe, called Canelo Alvarez Blake Griffin. And Canelo Alvarez ended up responding and saying, but see, if I ended up saying something about him, then people would call me a racist. Now, you had some of these channels overall, like Dante's Boxing Nation, that were stating, well, you know, what Floyd Mayweather said had no harm and all sort of stuff, but what you're saying is racist, all sort of bullshit. I always tell people this, the LDBC and the new media channels, they're very reminiscent of like a lot of these liberal pro-blackities, you know, overall of, you know, that of the liberal side. They're the first ones overall to try to piss everyone off, and then as soon as you say something or if you say anything that they don't agree with, they're the first ones to be the biggest bitches or the most emotional. It just is what it is. But the point is with Mayweather is that, you know, overall, although I don't think that he tried to be that harmful, Canelo Alvarez, I'm very sure, was highly bullied because of his looks, you know, especially being, you know, looking like a quote-unquote gringo. So, I mean, the point is that, you know, when it comes down to it, you know, Canelo Alvarez, I'm sure that he was highly bullied because of that, and that resonated with him a little bit differently.
Is already in the Guinness Book of World Records.
So the point of the story is this, is that if you're going to say something that might be offensive to somebody, you can't always be surprised when someone says something back to you, even if it seems on a different wavelength or a different level than what you were trying to operate on, because you may not know what that may particularly mean to that person. So, of course, it may not always behoove you to, you know, overall throw insults out there or throw certain jabs out there if you're not prepared for what comes back.
His introduction to the American mainstream came in May of 2010 on the undercard of Floyd Mayweather versus Shane Mosley.
We're seeing one now. Beautiful right hand right over the top.
There, a real promotional push began, with Canelo's unique look and fan-friendly style marking him as a potential star.
And Tony Weeks is going to stop.
This, of course, was his fight against Miguel Cotto's older brother, Jose Cotto, I believe. Cotto, I believe, also had 1 or 2 brothers that also were involved in boxing. That being stated overall, this was, you know, I believe that I had a talk with Fight Sports Film on my live stream as well, and he was saying that there's, you know, amounts of, you can count the amount of times that Canelo's probably been hurt on one hand. I've only seen Canelo Alvarez massively hurt within one fight, and it was this fight. This is the only fight ever that I've ever seen Canelo Alvarez really that badly hurt, and he was like 18 or 19 here. Every other fight, even if he was a little bit hurt, he didn't really show it that much. like I remember him being a little bit dazed and hurt against Golovkin, but it was nowhere near to the point, you know, of this fight. You know, I remember him being, I think, a little bit, you know, showing clear signs of possibly being a little bit hurt or feeling the power against Bivol, but not even Bivol really was ever close to knocking him down. I mean, it's just, this was really the only time that Canelo was ever seriously hurt.
Right there.
Maybe we have seen a piece of the future.
The TKO win over Jose Cotto was followed by dominant victories over Carlos Boldemir and Lovemore Ndu, cementing his place on the world stage. With confidence in his potential, Canelo was quickly pushed into world title contention.
And Canelo Alvarez is trying to keep this incredible momentum that he's built up going.
In March 2011, he outclassed Matthew Hatton over 12 rounds to capture the vacant WBC light middleweight championship, his first world title at just 20 years old.
Matthew Hatton, of course, who was the brother, I believe, of Ricky Hatton, who is, of course, the former pound-for-pound great. Talking about it, I believe that the man Q in my live stream, he stated about how he thought the early 2000s was a quote unquote weak era. Well, there are quote unquote weak eras, but the early 2000s, in my personal view, was not one of them. When you take a look at the 2000s, it had many talented fighters. Even if you thought that they were a bit flawed, they had a lot of talent. They had Barrera, they had Morales, they had Hatton, they had Zhu, they had Marquez, of course. They had Cotto. They had who else they have? Sugar Shane Mosley, Oscar De La Hoya. Joe Calzaghe, Bernard Hopkins. That actually was a very, very great era. That being stated, just to talk about it very quickly, one of the opponents, of course, that Floyd eventually ended up fighting and knocking out was Ricky Hatton. Ricky Hatton wasn't a guy that ever had the most extensive of resumes. I believe that he only had wins over about probably 3 notable fighters, like Paulie Malignaggi, Kostya Tszyu, and Jose Luis Castillo. But Ricky Hatton, let me tell you something about Ricky Hatton. He was someone that, of course, wasn't quite on the level of someone like a Floyd Mayweather or a Pacquiao. In my view, he wasn't even quite on the level of a Marquez, or of a Miguel Cotto. But the point overall is that Ricky Hatton was someone that was a legit A-grade level fighter. He was someone that was a bulldozer. He was not someone, in my view, that was always the most multidimensional fighter, but what he could do, he was very dangerous, and he was someone overall that had a lot of power, a lot of grit, a lot of toughness, a lot of heart. He was not someone overall that had great discipline. He was known for ballooning up in weight damn near to 200 pounds sometimes when he was not training. That's why they used to call him Ricky Fatten instead of Ricky Hatton. Anyway.
He defended it with 3 stoppage wins over Ryan Rhodes, Alfonso Gomez, and Kermit Cintron.
Good combination by Alvarez.
Yet his
just to reminisce over another fight, Alfonso Gomez. Alfonso Gomez was a Mexican contender who was okay. He was never really that great. Like, the biggest win of his career was, I believe, over an older and kind of outsized Arturo Gatti, who also was a little bit overrated in his career, in my personal view. But anyway. But the point overall is that Alfonso Gomez, I'll never forget his fight against Miguel Cotto. Cotto ended up whooping that man's ass so badly. Cotto is not usually someone that holds something against fighters. He usually has a little bit more passion for them, even if they do talk a lot of shit. Like, I remember his fights against Mayorga and some other guys, and he usually had passion for them. But for whatever fucking reason, Alfonso Gomez must have said something that really pissed Cotto off, because Cotto was looking at him the whole time like he was food. He really wanted to punish that man. And he probably could have stopped him a little bit earlier, but Cotto really, really, really wanted to punish that guy. Like, he made sure that he was surviving extra rounds. I don't know what the fuck he said overall to piss Cotto off, but he was really making sure to punish that man good.
He knew that beating contenders alone would not elevate him into superstardom. Big names were needed, and veterans like Shane Mosley and Miguel Cotto, faded but still respected, fit the bill.
But when Canelo lands, he's knocking Shane's head back.
That, of course, was the first big win in Canelo's career, at least when you talk about, when he was really put on the map. Sugar Shane Mosley at that time, in my view, was not an A-grade level fighter. That being stated, it would have not really mattered. Sugar Shane Mosley, in my view, was someone that, even at his absolute peak, he was not someone that was A+ in terms of skill. He did have some great wins. He beat Oscar De La Hoya. He beat, some other guys, Antonio Margarito, without the hand wraps and some other shit. But I mean, the point overall is that, Sugar Shane Mosley was someone that could be outboxed. And when you talk about it in terms of an all-around skill set, he wasn't as skilled as certain guys overall, like that of a Cotto or that of Marquez or certain guys like that, which is why at times he could be outboxed. He was outboxed overall by guys like Miguel Cotto. He was outboxed by guys like Fernand Forrest. He was outboxed by certain guys like that. He was not someone that was super defensively sound. He was someone that relied a lot on his athleticism, a lot on his speed. He did have a lot of boxing skill. Don't get it twisted. He is an all-time great level fighter. But is he someone that is as skilled as certain people try to say that he is? No. Is he someone that is as skilled as even a younger version of Canelo? No.
Mosley was overcome with ease over 12 rounds, and a destructive 5-round performance against Josecito Lopez seemed to set up a lucrative clash with Puerto Rico's Miguel Cotto.
Who will win? Cotto will win. It's a good fight.
I thought so, actually. I hope so too.
But with Cotto's surprise loss to Austin Trout, plans changed.
And still champion Austin.
Cotto, of course, was a little bit more on the downslide at this point in time. That being stated, he, after this, I believe, went with Freddie Roach, and he revived his career, and he got a little bit better, and he gained a little bit new energy because Freddie Roach was able to a little bit, mentally recreate him, so he was able to make Cotto born anew, which is why when you see certain fighters after they end up suffering a loss, oftentimes they end up getting tattoos. For those of you that notice, when Miguel Cotto, when he lost to Antonio Margarito, after he came back against a British fighter, that's when he started getting tattoos. Because for the fighter, when they end up losing that first fight in their career, they get humiliated and embarrassed, and they have to renew themselves and have to try to overall create a new persona, and state that I'm not the same person, that I'm a new person. And I have to be reminded of that with this tattoo that, overall I am a new person. And that's why Cotto, every time he would lose a fight, he would always get new tattoos, I believe. But anyway, this fight with Austin Trout, it was a competitive one, but to be quite honest with you, Cotto's not someone that really belongs at 154. He can win belts there because of how talented he is, but he's not someone that really is the same size as an Austin Trout.
Calls grew for Canelo to face Trout instead, who, unlike Cotto, was an undefeated 26-0 fighter in his prime, and as a relative unknown, presented a level of risk that Canelo's handlers preferred for him to not take.
Yes, and so once again, this narrative that Canelo fought many guys, completely out of their prime, or didn't fight guys at the best point in their career, all that is bullshit. I'm not claiming that there was not some names that Canelo didn't fight in their absolute peak or prime, but he fought many of them that did, and Austin Trout was the first one that he fought that was. Austin Trout was coming off the biggest win in his career over Miguel Cotto, and then on top of that, he was undefeated.
Canelo, however, knew the level of respect he would earn should he succeed. And in April of 2013, he stepped through the ropes to claim the most impressive scalp of his young career.
You have a conventional fighter, and there is Canelo.
Everyone remembers that right hand, making Austin Trout do the chicken dance.
Canelo's decision to face Austin.
Once again, you have so many of these guys that believe that Canelo Alvarez is just this one-dimensional fighter that only can fight in close range. Canelo is someone that has literally been able to outbox people in the mid-range like Austin Trout and Gennady Golovkin and other guys like that. Like, even Billy Joe Saunders to a degree. It's like, I don't think people realize how skilled Canelo Alvarez really is. At least when he was, more in his younger years. Anyway.
Trout so early drew widespread praise. It showed a maturity beyond his years and gave him the belief that he could compete with the very best. And that confidence quickly steered him towards the sport's ultimate challenge, Floyd Mayweather Jr., the pound-for-pound king and boxing's biggest attraction.
Teddy, we're watching Floyd make the walk to the stage. He looks confident, but then again, he always does.
The lure was irresistible.
Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my personal view, probably the most complete and the most skilled fighter that I've ever seen. Someone that made very few mistakes, someone that had like a 50% accuracy rating in terms of offensive statistics, which is extraordinarily hard to do even if you're an all-time grade level fighter. And then he was able to move up multiple weight classes, be outsized against certain guys, and still able to beat them, A-grade level fighters at that. And then on top of that, his defensive statistics also were pretty much the best we've ever seen as well. Floyd is, in my personal view, the greatest fighter I've ever seen. He's up there with certain athletes like Michael Jordan, Novak Djokovic, and, certain guys like that, Tom Brady, for the most complete package of an athlete we've ever seen. He's up there. And that's why when I state that, Canelo, in my view, I'm not going to claim that he was too green, but he was not someone that was at his absolute peak yet. That was kind of like, once again, when Patrick Mahomes first was facing off with Brady. Patrick Mahomes was still one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the league at that time, probably, but he was someone overall that, was obviously had Super Bowl potential, but he was not someone overall that was going to beat Tom Brady at that point because he just did not have the experience. And Canelo, yes, he had 40-something fights, but those 40-something fights weren't against guys that were the level that Floyd was fighting. So the point is that when Canelo fought 40 guys, a lot of those guys were kind of picked overall to make Canelo Alvarez look good or to gain a little bit of experience. In Floyd's fights, he had already been through much adversity and had fought so many different styles of A-grade championship level guys. So it's just a different level of experience. But the point overall is that, Canelo still was a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. Floyd proved his greatness by defeating Canelo Alvarez. And then later on, of course, I believe that Canelo would reach a new peak and a greater peak, you know, later on, probably several years later on down the road. But Floyd, in my view, just even at Canelo's best, though, Floyd is a all-around greater and even slightly more intelligent than Canelo, which says a lot because Canelo's a phenomenal fighter.
Not just the career-high payday, but the promise of glory on the grandest stage. Mayweather's team, meanwhile, took advantage of both Canelo's eagerness and naivety by insisting on a 152-pound catch weight, 2 pounds below the division limit.
The big story, though, Al Bernstein, Canelo Alvarez, going hit. There's nothing left that can come off his body. 152, but he made weight.
The anticipation reached fever pitch as the bout went on to break records, generating 150 million from 2.2 million pay-per-view buys, making it the highest grossing fight in boxing history at the time.
Here we go.
The action inside the ring, however, introduced Canelo to a harsh dose of reality, as the elusive Mayweather glided his way to a decision victory to claim the WBC, WBA, and Ring Magazine titles that were on the line.
Why weren't you able to get it going?
And of course, they tried to give Canelo Alvarez that fight the best way that they could. But they knew that they couldn't do it because they knew that it would just be way too glaring and it would have hurt the sport had they given Canelo Alvarez that robbery. There's no way that would have worked out. Canelo just had lost too many rounds in the fight. To be honest, you could debate that Floyd had won every single round in the fight against Canelo Alvarez. There was just no way to debate that Canelo had won the fight. And yet, I think that 2 of the judges scored it 8 rounds to 4, and 1 judge scored it a draw. The reason why is because, once again, and I always tell people this, boxing always has plans for people overall later on in the future, and they had plans for Canelo. They knew that what they had in Canelo, that he was a golden boy, he was someone that could connect overall with basically everybody, especially a lot of the Mexican or the Latinos, and on top of that, the Caucasians as well. You know, if you want to call them that, you know, overall the quote-unquote whites or whatever you want to call them. The point overall is that Canelo basically had the all-around package. Then on top of that, he was a highly skilled fighter and a highly entertaining fighter. And Floyd was 36 at the time. He still was pretty much at the peak of his career. That was probably the last fight where he was at the peak of his career. But there was only so much more they really had planned for him. So the point is that they were really trying to move on, but Floyd didn't allow it to happen. So that's basically what ended up happening right there. But that's why overall it happens with everybody. They phase everybody out eventually. You know, Chavez, that's why they, you know, fed De La Hoya to him, pronounced Sweet Pea Whitaker with De La Hoya. That's why De La Hoya got the benefit of the doubt over him. Everyone is going to get phased out eventually. You know, even Canelo Alvarez. Canelo, of course, you know, he still has a little bit more use, but he only has use for about, you know, 3 more fights.
No, simplemente no pude agarrarlo.
For a young champion whose rise had been built on self-belief, the loss on such a stage was crushing. But instead of breaking him, the setback fueled his determination, as he vowed never to be outclassed again and sharpened his game with a renewed hunger to improve.
El Perro, I believe Alfredo Angulo. For those of you, of course, that were around, Alfredo Angulo was someone that, you know, he was someone that was okay. He was a good, solid B-grade level contender. You know, but this is what I mean overall when I say overall that certain fighters, like B-grade level fighters, for example, because I believe that my man Q in the live stream, he said, well, you're telling me like Jerome Butsenis, for example, you know, with Karen Kuchachian or Chukajan or whatever his name is, you know, he's hitting Jerome Butsenis with good shots and taking good shots and winning multiple rounds, and he possibly can't be an A-grade level fighter. Well, there are certain fighters overall, once again, that are B-grade level fighters, and they'll give tough fights to anybody. You know, like once again, and even if we want to compare it in UFC standards, like, you know, someone actually brought up a very great point. Like Michael Johnson is someone that gave like tough fights to so many people. He beat Dustin Poirier at one point in time. Like he gave Gaethje a little bit of a tough fight. He was someone that at one point in time defeated Tony Ferguson and Edson Barbosa when they weren't really A-grade level fighters. There are certain fighters that are B-grade level fighters, but you know that they're going to give anyone they face hell. You know, Emmanuel Augustus was another one of those fighters, which I believe the same man brought up earlier. Thank you for that. You know, there are certain fighters that when you take a look at them, you know, they're B-grade level fighters, but they're if you're in line to fight this guy, you're like, ah, shit, like this guy's going to be a real fucking problem. You know, Tony Harrison was that guy at 154. There are just certain guys that are like that. You know, B-grade level fighters, but you know if you're about to fight him, that it's going to be, you know, it's going to be hell for at least a little part of the fight.
He wasted
And Alfredo Angulo was able to give hell to certain fighters. Like, he gave hell to Araceli Lara. You know, I believe that he pressured him the whole fight. He also knocked him down twice, although Lara, I thought, was a little bit too overconfident in that fight. But Lara got back on his bicycle, and of course, he was actually eventually able to break Alfredo Angulo's orbital eye bone. But that being stated, overall, Alfredo Angulo was a B grade level fighter, but he was no A grade level fighter. But Austin Trout definitely was. But we're going to go through all the opponents and talk about who, in my view, was A grade. Austin Trout so far is the only A grade level fighter, in my view, that Canelo fought, that he fought. Anyway.
little time with tune-ups, stopping the rugged Alfredo Angulo before facing the Cuban counterpuncher Erislandy Lara, who, much like Austin Trout a year earlier, presented a level of risk Canelo insisted on pursuing.
I didn't like this fight. It's a dangerous fight.
I want to fight Lara.
Que Oscar no haya recomendado pelear con él, pero en lo personal yo quiero pelear con los rivales más peligrosos y ganar esta pelea por orgullo.
That's why I give Canelo Alvarez a lot of props. This narrative that Canelo Alvarez just ducked everybody and all sorts of all that is a bunch of horse shit. I'm not claiming that there's not certain fights that maybe Canelo Alvarez did not avoid, like the David Benavidez fight and the Andrade fight. You know, I believe, of course, he kind of avoided that one. That being said, we'll talk about Andrade later, but I can't really blame Canelo Alvarez for not taking that fight, because it's like, if you're Andrade, it's like, dude, what the fuck have you really done in your career? Like, almost nobody knows you except the super diehard boxing fans. Then on top of that, you're a guy that is a little bit dangerous, but you don't really have that much monetary value. You're someone overall that isn't that well known. It's like, why the fuck would I want to fight you? That's a fight overall that's very dangerous. And then on top of that, like, you don't really have much of a public profile. So, I mean, unfortunately, Andrade, he kind of fucked himself over in terms of a lot of bigger fights. He made a lot of bad decisions in his career. But anyways, Lara was really, in my view, an undefeated fighter. He only suffered one loss at this point, and it was against Paul Williams. That was probably the worst daylight robbery I've ever seen in my life. But Lara also, of course, was able to stop Alfredo Angulo, who was a solid B-grade level fighter. And, of course, he completely outboxed Austin Trout, who at the time, that was really the last, after the Lara fight, Austin Trout was never an A-grade level fighter again. And interesting enough, Lara, he was never quite the same after the Canelo fight. I never seen a peak performance from Lara like this ever again after the Canelo fight. He never quite moved around the same after this. Anyway. So this would be the second A-grade level win in Canelo's career.
The tricky southpaw was an expert counterpuncher whose disengaging style had the potential to make Canelo relive some of the same difficulties he faced against Mayweather. But this time, the Mexican had the tactical sense to adjust, cut the ring, and ramp up the pressure with heavier punching to earn a close, split decision victory.
You know, this fight was very comparable to Artur Beterbiev versus Dimitri Bivol in the first fight, where I've had certain people come to my comment section and they've said, well, the person overall who lands the more punches or the more cleaner or accurate shots, that's the person who wins the fight. Well, at times it wins you the fight. But if the other person also looks hurt at certain times, or if it looks like their game plan is working more, then yeah, that other person can win the fight, especially if you're starting to slow down. And Bivol, in that first fight against Beterbiev, he got hurt, first of all, like 3 separate times. He was wobbled like 3 separate times. Then on top of that, he had more damage to his face, I believe. Then overall on top of that, Artur Beterbiev was starting to clearly wear him down in the second half of the fight. So that's why Beterbiev, in my view, clearly won that first fight, at least by a little bit. Now, the second fight, I thought Bivol made some great adjustments and it just pulled out. But it is what it is. But anyways, this fight right here, Canelo versus Lara, it's very comparable to a fight like Beterbiev versus Bivol, where one fighter was the more accurate and the sharper puncher with that of a Lara. But Canelo Alvarez was someone where, towards the end of the fight, in the second half of the fight, his game plan and his ring generalship was starting to show a little bit. And his pressure overall was once again, starting, to kind of get to Lara. A lot of the body shots were, he made Lara bleed. He cut him, I believe, in the 7th or the 8th round. And then on top of that, Lara was starting to slow down. He was starting to throw less and less. So, yes, Canelo probably had just pulled out this fight. It was a very close fight. It could have went either way. But I can understand why the judges gave it to Canelo. I mean, it was obvious that Oscar was a little bit behind it as well, because Levi Martinez, no offense, Levi Martinez is one of the worst fucking scores I've ever seen in my life. Every score that I've ever seen him have, I remember he had a score with Scott Quigg and Carl Frampton, and he scored Scott Quigg to actually beating Carl Frampton. He's one of the worst judges ever. He pretty basically only scores off of pressure, but he scored it 9 rounds to 3 for Canelo. And listen, you could debate that Canelo won the fight, but it wasn't no 9 rounds to 3.
The hard-fought win over Lara restored much of Canelo's reputation, and his march towards superstardom gathered pace. He rattled off 5 more victories, including a decision over Miguel Cotto for the WBC.
Once again, let me also state this, because people will say, well, Cotto was older and all sort of stuff. He definitely was older. He was 35 years old. But let me also state this. Cotto was not washed up. Cotto was someone that very clearly, when you take a look at him, he had gained even new skills from that of Freddie Roach. He was someone overall that was more refreshed and more revived because he was with a new coach and a new career. You know, he was someone that had the WBC middleweight title and the Ring magazine title, so he was not someone that was washed up. He still was an A-grade level fighter. And in the fight, Canelo Alvarez still had a very close 8 rounds to 4 fight with him. So no, Cotto was not washed up in that fight. So that is the third A-grade level fighter that Canelo has defeated in his career. And of course, Cotto was an all-time grade level fighter. Although, of course, obviously smaller than him.
Weight title, as well as an all-Mexican showdown with Julio Cesar Chavez Jr.
Give me a fucking break. Chavez Jr. has been either taking paychecks or, you know, overall pretty much been a guy that's been irrelevant for really the past 10 years. Chavez Jr. is someone overall that pretty much has embarrassed his father to the max. And to be honest with you, Chavez Jr. was kind of the recipient of certain favors because of his father overall in the WBC weight class, or excuse me, at the middleweight class. I believe that he ended up getting a title or something like something happened with Sergio Martinez, where Sergio Martinez, I think like he got his title taken away or something off of some bullshit. I can't remember exactly what happened, you know, but Sergio Martinez, like they wanted the fight to happen or something like that. Then HBO or, you know, whatever belt was holding it, the WBC, they were forcing Sergio to fight this other guy, and it made no fucking sense. And, you know, so some ended up happening there. I can't remember overall what ended up happening, but, you know, to my recollection, Sergio Martinez got screwed. Now, maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe I need to remember more details. But anyway. And to talk about Miguel Cotto, Cotto maybe wasn't at the absolute peak of his career, if you want to state that, but, you know, he was someone that very clearly was still an A-grade level fighter. And this dude, James Kirkland, of course, interestingly enough, Canelo stated that James Kirkland, that he actually was the hardest puncher that he had ever fought. Now, do I believe that Kirkland really is the hardest puncher that he ever fought? Probably not. But that being stated, you know, certain fighters, when they don't expect that fighter to punch quite as hard, they get a little bit surprised. And, of course, Canelo was smaller here.
And with highlight reel knockouts of James Kirkland, Amir Khan, and Liam Smith, he reinforced his standing as both a dynamic boxer puncher and one of the sport's most entertaining attractions.
And in my view, all those guys are B-grade level fighters that they just mentioned, other than Miguel Cotto.
But while Canelo was rising, a new force was terrorizing the middleweight division. Gennady Triple G Golovkin, holder of the WBA and IBF titles, had also picked up the WBC belt Canelo vacated.
Middleweight champion. Oh, big right there.
Apart
That Asian fighter, that Japanese fighter, I believe his name was Ishida, that Golovkin actually had knocked out, that actually was the fighter that pulled off one of the biggest upsets against James Kirkland. James Kirkland came into the fight, I believe he was a massive favorite. And then overall, Ishida came into the fight. I think he knocked him out in like the first round maybe, or maybe it was the first 3. So, but anyways, to talk about people's points overall, especially Q's points about what makes an A-grade level fighter or a B-grade level fighter, if you cannot defeat even an A- level fighter in your career, in my personal view, you are not an A-grade level fighter. That's just my personal view of it. And when I take a look at Gennady Golovkin, he was someone that was running through a lot of guys. He also defeated Danny Jacobs, who wasn't just an A- level fighter. He was probably about an A-grade level fighter. He was a legit contender. He was someone that was a very dangerous fighter. So Danny, you know, so when Q came into my live stream and he stated, well, Danny Jacobs doesn't seem that good to me. Danny Jacobs is someone that in terms of boxing ability, he's not as sharp as some other guys. But that being stated, Danny Jacobs is a real deal fighter. He defeated Peter Quillen in the first round. Once again, for those of you that go that far back, Peter Quillen and Gennady Golovkin for years were looked at as the 2 best middleweights in the world. Now, Quillen was never on the same level as Golovkin, and Quillen was avoiding, you know, Gennady Golovkin, you know, overall like like I don't know, overall basically overall like child support. But the point overall is that Peter Quillen, the reason why he said that is because he knew that he could not beat Golovkin. He knew he was going to get his ass whooped. But the point overall is that once he fought Danny Jacobs, Peter Quillen, I believe, actually was favored in that fight. It was looked at as a 50-50 level fight, and Danny Jacobs ended up knocking him out within the first round. He also beat Sergio Moro, who was a very decent, B grade level fighter, former champion, I believe. He ended up knocking him out once or twice, and beat some other fighters that were, very good as well. Caleb Truax, who later on would get an upset victory over that of a James DeGale, who was at one point in time the best 168-pounder. So Danny Jacobs was a legitimate, A-grade level fighter. He wasn't just, some bum.
From the decision over Daniel Jacobs, Golovkin was on a merciless 23-fight knockout streak.
Now, to be fair overall to Q's point, Danny Jacobs, I don't think, other than maybe Peter Quillen, ever defeated an A-grade level fighter. But against the B-grade level champions that he even seen, he was severely dominant. And if you're someone that is severely dominant over B-grade level fighters, or at least clearly winning, then that, in my view, is an indication that you're an A-grade level fighter. At least if you're consistent. There might be one or two fights that you have against B-grade level fighters to where, is very troubling. But when it comes down to it overall, you should be mainly consistent in your victories against B-grade level fighters. But if you're losing like Adrian Broner or having draws against them, then, then all of a sudden, of course, that's a little bit different.
And widely regarded as the most dangerous puncher in boxing. The Kazakh represented exactly the kind of risk fans wanted Canelo to take. And after months of delays, the blockbuster clash finally came together in September 2017.
Everyone is expecting a fight.
Let me also state this, and as you could see there, Golovkin was legitimately bigger than Canelo. We're going to rewind this. But there's many people, of course, that believe that Canelo was this quote-unquote weight bully at 160. That no, actually, he really wasn't. He was actually outweighed, I believe, by both Danny Jacobs and Gennady Golovkin. They were both bigger than him. So, no, actually, that's not the case. That being stated overall, Canelo Alvarez, many people will state that Golovkin, that he wasn't at the peak of his career, that he was old, that he was wide. No, he really wasn't. Gennady Golovkin was someone that was 36 years old when Canelo beat him in the rematch, yes. But that being stated, he was still at the peak of his career. Gennady Golovkin knocked out Vanes Martirosyan within literally like 2 rounds, I believe. That's a fighter that, keep in mind, had never been knocked down before. And then on top of that, he had actually given Andrade, Lara, overall, and the Charlo brothers, I believe, all competitive fights. He wasn't ever necessarily an A-grade level fighter, but Vanes Martirosyan is another example of a B-grade level fighter that will give certain A-grade level fighters hell. He'll never win, but, he'll be someone overall that gives them tough, decisions. And Golovkin knocked that motherfucker out within 2 rounds.
Classic. Will Triple G and Canelo author the latest chapter in the glorious history of the middleweight championship of the world?
In many ways, Golovkin became the measuring stick for both Canelo's lowest and highest moments. Their first encounter was difficult, with Golovkin appearing the stronger, more commanding fighter over 12 taxing rounds. Most expected his hand to be raised, but in a highly controversial decision, the fight was scored a draw.
I think a draw would have more than likely probably been okay, but the problem is that Adelaide Byrd scored the fight like 118 to 110 or something like that. Like, she scored it like 10 rounds. Adelaide Byrd, by the way, is one of the worst fucking scorers of all time. There's no way that shit, like, Levi Martinez, Adelaide Byrd, those are 2, and whoever fucking scored the draw for Canelo and Mayweather, like, those are 3 judges that should never, ever, ever, ever be allowed to score a boxing fight ever again. Ever.
It's officially a draw.
And Adelaide Byrd doesn't even just judge that of boxing. She also judges that of UFC. And I've seen her give multiple awful fucking decisions also in UFC as well. I honestly don't know how the fuck she still has a job, but she probably overall has slipped some money under the table, to be quite honest with you. That's why some of these, like, politicians, for example, some people are like, oh, how come they still have jobs? How come they still have this? Because they still have a very good use for them. It's very similar for judges in boxing. If they can be used overall by that of the higher ups, then, they probably won't get fired. Now, if you fuck up, overall and mess up their money, overall against, one of their golden boys, then yeah, they'll probably, fire you. But the point overall is that, in this, no. Because in this fight, they really wanted Canelo to win. Canelo's a Mexican fighter overall. Like, I believe that he mentioned that I feel bad for a lot of these Eastern European fighters because they get screwed over. Well, of course they get screwed over. Who the hell is, other than maybe some Caucasians, who really is cheering for the Eastern European fighters? They don't speak English that particularly well. They're not super popular over here. The ones that are usually popular and the ones that sell the most are usually that of either the Latinos or that of the black fighters. So they're usually always going to get the benefit of the doubt over those type of fighters. Now, can Caucasians still, be the benefit of the doubt with certain decisions? Yes, but you're still going to have to be from an area to where overall, it's very affluent in boxing, or it's looked at as a boxing kingdom, like Mexico or Britain or the USA.
Clash was fierce, with much of the criticism unfairly aimed at Canelo, and calls for an immediate rematch became impossible to ignore.
Do you want a rematch, Canelo?
Si la gente lo quiere, hacemos la revancha.
If the people want it, yes.
Yet just as the second fight neared, another twist deepened the rivalry. Canelo failed a drug test in camp, leading to a 6-month suspension.
Golden Boy Promotions, Canelo's promoter, came out yesterday and blamed tainted Mexican meat for the positive test, saying...
Even in his absence, anticipation for the rematch only grew. And after tense negotiations, the sequel was rescheduled exactly 1 year after their initial meeting.
Just the fact that Golovkin is attacking Canelo's character. Canelo, he's had it, and he's fed up.
Well, at the end of the day, Canelo had no one else to put the blame but himself. I'm sorry, but I'm not believing this tainted meat bullshit. That's been an excuse overall for a lot of the Mexican fighters that have popped up dirty down there for a while. Well, then if you know the meat is tainted, why the fuck are you still eating it? And the point is that Canelo Alvarez ain't having just any random meat. He's having meat overall that is quote-unquote organic and carefully selected. Canelo is just more than likely a PED user. It just is what it is. That being stated, I've also had my suspicions about Crawford and anyone with a snack program. But anyway.
Gone was the civility of the first build-up. In its place stood bitterness and resentment. Canelo, usually reserved, wore the weight of criticism openly. And when fight night arrived in Las Vegas, both men unleashed every ounce of that animosity.
Good left hook there by Canelo. Once again, this is why I stayed. Like, people just think that Canelo's just this one-dimensional fighter that can only fight on the inside. Like, I've seen certain channels say, well, if Canelo is anywhere near on the level of Crawford, how come he has to punch on the elbows and the shoulders and stuff like that and not land certain flush punches? Canelo really only started doing that once he started moving up to super middleweight and he was clearly outsized. Even when you take a look at this frame right here, Canelo was nowhere near, I mean, I'm not going to say nowhere near, excuse me, but he's still very clearly, about, it looks like, slightly smaller than Triple G. So, I mean, the point is, and Canelo was pretty much able to beat him in the mid-range the whole fight. So, my point is that Canelo's not just this one-dimensional pressure fighter. He can fight within whatever range that he pleases. And he is exceptional in the mid-range and also that in up-close range, at least at his absolute best. He can fight on the back foot, too. He's just someone that isn't quite as effective there because of his feet. But anyway.
Unlike the first bout, Canelo pressed forward with aggression.
Crawford's going to have to watch out for that punch, by the way.
Determined to prove a point. Golovkin, relying on his jab and footwork, boxed off the back foot before rallying late to close strong.
And that's how you know that Golovkin was having a lot of problems with Canelo, because Golovkin was talking all this shit about, I want a Mexican fight and all this other shit. Gennady Golovkin overall was talking all this shit, overall about fighting Mexican style, big drama show, all this other stuff. He was talking about all this other stuff, and then as soon as Canelo Alvarez really pushed forward and started landing those body shots, Golovkin started backing up, at least in the first several rounds, because he knew overall that Canelo Alvarez, that, he was starting to adjust. And Canelo was the faster fighter, and he carried enough power to hurt Triple G, and Triple G just could not stand in there with Canelo Alvarez the whole time.
What unfolded was a war of staggering intensity, surpassing their original clash.
They have appreciated every moment.
But this time, the decision belonged to Canelo. Though razor thin on the score...
Yes, as it should have been, and this was Gennady Golovkin at the peak form of his career. I've already stated this. Just because a fighter overall is a little bit older doesn't mean that they're not at the peak form of their career. Bernard Hopkins was basically at the peak of his career until about 45 years old. when he was beating guys like Tarver and facing with guys like Calzaghe and Winky Wright and Kelly Pavlik and certain guys like that. You know, Archie Moore was still basically at the peak of his career in his early 40s when he was still beating guys overall at light heavyweight, I believe, facing Rocky Marciano. You know, overall, Alexander Usyk is still at a relative peak form right now, and he's 38 years old. So, I mean, the point is that just because a fighter's a little bit older, it all depends on the wear and tear, how much, you know, wear and tear they've had in the professional circuit, you know, and on top of that, the level of competition that they fought, you know, and of course their fighting style as well. So just because someone's a bit older does not mean that they're still not at the peak of their career. Anyway, you know, and everyone ages differently. But Golovkin, once again, this is the 4th A-grade level win in Canelo's career.
Cards, his victory was seen as earned, even by his detractors.
And Canelo landed more power punches, I believe, in this fight. He landed a higher accuracy of power punches. He also landed, I believe, the more punches in this fight as well, I believe anyway. So Canelo deserved to win this fight.
And after a year of controversy and doubt, Canelo Alvarez finally secured the most defining win of his career. The victory over Golovkin elevated Canelo to the very peak of the sport, giving him both the profile and financial clout to embark on one of the most dominant runs in recent boxing memory.
The ref's going to wipe this fight over. Oh, big punish.
I remember, you know, people were talking about that fight between Canelo Alvarez and Rocky Fielding. You know, now I believe that they, maybe the Danny Jacobs fight happened right after this. Actually, it may have happened right after this. But anyways, the point is that for those of you that actually don't know, 3 weeks before this, Canelo actually was very pissed off because he had to deal with the Mexican cartel. And they actually had kidnapped his brother, I believe maybe it was Ramon Alvarez or something like that. I don't remember. But they kidnapped one of his brothers and he had to deal with those guys and give him like $3 million in order for them to release him. So Canelo was holding a lot of animosity. Boxers, man, like when they get pissed off, you don't want to overall fuck with them because they love taking out, you know, their demons overall out in the ring. Certain guys like Canelo, he does that. He's not as someone that is, you know, as dark in the ring as say someone like a Mike Tyson or Roberto Duran, but he's still someone overall that knows how to use it to his edge.
After 2 successful outings against Rocky Fielding,
there wasn't ever overall a time where I thought that Rocky Fielding was ever going to stand a chance against Canelo. It was very obvious to me that he was not an A-grade level fighter. He was someone that was an okay contender, but he wasn't A-grade. But Danny Jacobs at this time, he was legit A-grade. He had defeated Sergey Derevyanchenko, the first loss of his career. I thought that he clearly won 8 rounds to 4. Danny Jacobs also gave Golovkin a 7 rounds to 5 fight. I thought that he had just lost the fight, but, you know, overall it was still against Gennady Golovkin, so a tremendous performance. And, of course, he beat Peter Quillen and Sergio Mora. So Danny Jacobs was a legit A-grade level fighter. He does not have the worst resume for a fighter. So this was pretty much, you know, when Golovkin and Danny Jacobs had fought Canelo, this pretty much was their last great performances, at least at an A-grade level. Gennady Golovkin still was an A-grade fighter after the Canelo rematch, but it was very apparent that he was never the same fighter after those 2 fights. And Danny Jacobs, he still had a little bit of greatness left within him you know, after this fight, but he was never quite the same like a couple of fights after that. Anyway. But this is the 5th A-grade level win in Canelo's career.
Jacobs, he briefly jumped up to light heavyweight to stop a faded Sergey Kovalev for the WBO title.
And Sergey Kovalev, in my view, is the 6th A-grade level win in Canelo Alvarez's career. Now, what certain people will mention is that, well, Kovalev wasn't the same fighter as what he once was, and you're absolutely right. But does that necessarily mean that it's not an A-grade level win? Do we not claim overall that the win that, you know, overall Floyd Mayweather got over Oscar De La Hoya is an A-grade level win? Do we not claim overall that, you know, maybe certain other wins that certain fighters got over other fighters were not A-grade level wins just because they were a little bit older or not quite the same? The point is that this still was an A-grade level win because Kovalev was someone that it's not like he wasn't a champion anymore. He had defeated 2 undefeated guys at the light heavyweight division that were looked at as very dangerous and talented. He defeated Eleider Alvarez, someone who had knocked him out, of course, previously, but then, of course, he knocked him out in the rematch. Then, of course, he knocked out the undefeated Anthony Yard, someone who eventually would become later, you know, very talented, someone that didn't really prove himself quite as much in the light heavyweight division, but still one of the top contenders. And Kovalev, I believe, was the WBO light heavyweight champion in the world, and he was clearly 2 weight classes bigger than Canelo, and Canelo was able to stop him. Now, certain people believe that this fight was fixed. I mean, that's kind of up to you. I don't have enough information to say. But the point overall is that Canelo was able to get the victory overall against Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, so this would be the 6th A-grade level win in his career. Now, he did have a rehydration limit, and Kovalev didn't have that much time off. But the point is that Canelo never belonged in the ring with Kovalev in the first place. Kovalev was a legit A-plus level puncher, even at this point in time in his career, or a legit A-grade level puncher, and he was someone that could still box, and Canelo clearly was smaller than him, although he clearly was a bit more yoked up for this fight. But still, this still, in my view, is an A- level win for Canelo Alvarez's career. Kovalev was still an A- level fighter. He was a champion at the light heavyweight division. Now, if this, it had the same stipulations happen, probably under that of another light heavyweight, then yeah, I could probably see how I could say B grade level win. But for Canelo, someone that's really not even a natural super middleweight, no, this has to be counted up there. And Canelo Alvarez had only one fight at super middleweight where he wasn't even adjusted to the weight class yet, and he fought Rocky Fielding. So this really was kind of moving up 2 weight classes. It was quite amazing what Canelo was able to do. And the fight previously before then, he had fought Danny Jacobs. So I mean, it was quite phenomenal what Canelo Alvarez was able to do here. Anyway,
making him a 3-weight world champion.
And certain people may say, well, Canelo, he had a rehydration limit here. It's the same rehydration clause that Andre Ward had in the rematch. So that's up to you. If you want to discredit Canelo Alvarez because of that, that's up to you, no problem. But then you also have to keep the same standard with Andre Ward in the rematch. In my view, because Canelo clearly is not the same size as a Kovalev, to me it's still an A-grade level winner, A-. Kovalev, of course, was not the same top 10 pound-for-pound fighter as what he used to be, but he still was dangerous. This was the last great Kovalev that we had ever seen. After this fight, he pretty much was done.
5th gear, Canelo is the light heavyweight champion of the world.
But Canelo ultimately settled on a singular goal: to stay at 168 and unify the entire super middleweight division. His mission began against the most established champion, Callum Smith, whom he outclassed to claim.
Many people, of course, I think kind of disrespect Callum Smith. In my view, Callum Smith is actually one of the more underrated boxers in all of boxing. He's someone that, of course, you can tell has a little bit of that stiff, Caucasian, British style, or, that stiff British style. Because, to be fair, actually all demographics of fighters, from Britain kind of fight in that style usually. But, I mean, the point overall is that Callum Smith does have a little bit of that stiff, style from Britain. But the point is that he's probably the best version of that style that you could see. He's someone that can move around a little bit with his head. He's someone that has excellent counterpunching ability. He sets up traps extraordinarily well. And he's really someone, to be quite honest with you, that's a light heavyweight. He was someone that overall was a real, he was huge for that weight class. He was a bit of a weight bully. So this was a legit A-grade level win in Canelo Alvarez's career, at the very least A-. And of course, we've seen Callum Smith recently in his fight against Joshua Buatsi, a very talented fighter. And Callum Smith beat him, in my view, 9 rounds to 3. Wasn't even close.
The WBA and WBA.
And let's also not forget that Callum Smith knocked out George Groves in very easy fashion. And George Groves was someone that gave Carl Froch hell. He was also someone that beat Chris Eubank Jr. and someone that gave Badu Jack a tough time as well. Anyway.
See titles.
Golovkin's back, and he is throwing much harder right now. It's Callum Smith up on the ropes. Lands a right hand.
So this will be the 7th A-grade level win in Canelo's career.
Next came Billy Joe Saunders, the slick WBO champion, whose reign ended with a satisfying bone-crunching assault.
Pun intended.
They have stopped the fight!
Billy Joe Saunders was another A-grade level fighter in my view. This was the 8th level win, an A-grade level win in Canelo's career. Billy Joe Saunders was someone that, and when someone like Q overall, like I said, he mentioned, well, how do we know that these guys are on a different level? Well, first of all, you can take a look at their talent. These guys are just better than someone like a Aegis Kavalauskas or better than someone like a Jose Benavidez. Aegis Kavalauskas is someone that gave 2 tough fights to Virgil Ortiz and also that of a Terrence Bud Crawford, but he has no elite level wins in his career. Now, there are certain fighters that I would consider A-grade level talents that don't have any elite wins in their career, really, even over B-grade level fighters like Islam Madrimov, I guess. But I mean, the point is that, when you take a look at Kavalauskas, he's just very clearly not an A-grade level fighter. Callum Smith has wins over George Groves and Joshua Buatsi. Those are 2 bigger wins than whatever happened in Kavalauskas' career. When you take a look at Saunders, he got victories over Chris Eubank Jr. and also over Andy Lee when Andy Lee was a champion. And Andy Lee had a draw, I believe, he had a draw over Peter Quillen, who was undefeated at the time, who was looked at as the 2nd best middleweight in the world behind Gennady Golovkin. and was looked at as around an A- level fighter. So overall, Andy Lee was not just some bitch of a fighter. He was someone that overall was at least a legit B grade level fighter. And he beat other guys too, like Matt Korobov and, overall other guys, I believe, like, what was his name? John David Jackson Jr. He was someone that, to be quite honest with you, although it's controversial, you might even be able to debate that Andy Lee was an A- level fighter. He was someone that defeated some fighters that were no fucking joke. So, I mean, Andy Lee was someone that, in my view, was more B+, but still, he was not a joke of a fighter. Billy Joe Saunders clearly outboxed him. And he also clearly outboxed Dave Lemieux, who was a great former champion, at least B grade level, and also Chris Eubank Jr. earlier in his career. So Billy Joe Saunders very clearly, combined with his talent, was an A grade level fighter.
Finally, that left the IBF champion, Caleb Plant, a skilled southpaw.
Caleb Plant was someone that, of course, as of recent, he hasn't aged quite as well, but he was someone that at the peak of his career, he beat Jose Uzcategui, who, of course, was known for knocking out one of the Durrell brothers. Two fighters that were looked at as very, very competitive and, pretty decent for that super middleweight division. Andre Durrell was someone that I don't think was ever a champion, but he was one of the more talented contenders at that weight class. Jose Uzcategui knocked him out. Jose Uzcategui was a very talented fighter. Caleb Plant came in there, beat him at a clear 8 rounds to 4. Then later on, he would also beat Caleb Truax, who wasn't anywhere near above a B grade level fighter, but he was someone that at one time did get an upset victory over James DeGale. So Caleb Plant was a legit A- or A grade level fighter. He was someone that was legit. And in my view, have you had the peak version of Caleb Plant, he probably would have beaten guys like Jamal Charlo and possibly even Andrade as well.
Who promised to hold Canelo's march to history.
And let's not forget that Caleb Plant gave David Benavidez a very tough fight, even right after he was off for about a year and just got knocked out against Canelo.
But across 11 rounds...
So this is the 9th A-grade level win in Canelo's career.
Plant's resistance was gradually eroded before Canelo closed the show with a punishing finish.
Caleb Plant, although Fight Sports Talk, I believe that he mentioned a point that he thought Caleb Plant was up early in the fight. I mean, I thought that he won 3 of the first 4, but after that, I thought Canelo Alvarez was clearly starting to gain on him. I thought by round 6, it was 3-3. I thought Canelo was clearly up in the fight. And it was, Caleb Plant tried, but he just didn't use enough lateral foot movement in this fight. This is the fight that Crawford really needs to watch to make sure that he doesn't do this same shit, because Caleb Plant, he tied up Canelo Alvarez, but in such a poor way. Like, he tied up one arm and then completely let Canelo Alvarez's right arm free to where Canelo could just shoot the overhand on him and, pretty much just wear down, his shoulder and that of his head. I mean, it really was, not the best game plan by Plant. And then on top of that, he just wasn't willing to trade enough with Canelo and, really stand his ground. And then C, he just stood up against ropes way too long, which really was his ultimate demise. But that's why when Caleb Plant, when he said, I'm a pretty good fighter, he was asking for validation, because that was basically his admittance of, I need your validation because I know I'm not going to last this whole entire fight.
Alvarez has done it. It took a long time to come, but when it came, he finished it quite brilliantly.
The victory crowned him as the first 4-belt undisputed champion in super middleweight history, further solidifying his status as the sport's premier name.
Let me also state this, because I believe Q, he talked about Canelo Alvarez potentially being a top 30 super middleweight of all time. He's definitely a lot higher than top 30. He's at the very least a top 7 to top 10 super middleweight of all time. I to be honest with you, I don't even think that there's a debate about that. That being stated, do I think that he's the greatest super middleweight ever? I would probably say the greatest super middleweight ever, in my view, either goes to Andre Ward or Joe Calzaghe, combined with both the resume and their accomplishments, and also who I think would have won probably at their peak level, just because I don't think Canelo Alvarez is a natural super middleweight, but he would have had a chance against those guys potentially. He would have had a possible chance. But, there are great super middleweights. James Toney, of course, Mike McCallum, I believe. Roy Jones Jr., certain guys like that.
His triumph at 168 was historic, but not unique. Other champions across different weight classes had also unified their divisions. And determined to separate himself further, Canelo sought to make history as the first fighter ever to become undisputed in 2 separate weight classes.
I'm really excited and I'm going to prepare myself really good because this fight is going to be really hard.
To do so, he moved back up to light heavyweight to face the WBA champion Dmitry Bivol. Unknown to many American audiences, Bivol was a technically brilliant operator.
Anyone who knew Dmitry Bivol, anyone who wasn't someone that just watched boxing casually or someone that really knew who Dmitry Bivol was, we all knew that this was going to be a hard fight for Canelo. And we all knew that there was a possibility that he was not going to pull out of this because Dmitry Bivol was someone that, first of all, was a light heavyweight. Canelo's not really a natural light heavyweight. Then on top of that, secondly, Bivol is someone that was at the very least looked at as the second best light heavyweight in the world. And he had never had a competitive fight. Like, he literally beat the shit out of every contender that he ever fought. Even Joe Smith Jr. and that of, Jean Pascal. So that's why I say, if you're performing that well against A- or B grade level fighters, and you're just whooping their ass on a daily basis, that tells me that more than likely you're an A- level fighter at the very least. And Bivol is definitely above an A-. He's an A+. Bivol is someone that is the best light heavyweight in the world right now. And the fact that Canelo was probably able to still pull out 3 or 4 rounds on the fight against Bivol, in my personal view, it definitely wasn't as close as what the judges scored it. But the point is that Canelo was still able to pull out a good 3 to 4 rounds, and he had Bivol landing at a 21% ratio. So, I mean, or accuracy. So the point is that shows you how great Canelo is, that he's probably outweighed overall against Bivol and outsized clearly, and he's still able to make it the most competitive fight in Bivol's career before the Artebedabiev, rematch and overall the Artebedabiev fights. So that just goes to show you once again how great Canelo is, with the fact that he was outsized. That fight was, overall very comparable to kind of like the Trinidad versus Bernard Hopkins, where he kind of was out of his element. It was against 2 pound-per-pound level fighters, but overall, the one guy was clearly out of his element, in terms of size. But anyway.
Fleet-footed,
and don't get it twisted. I'm not claiming that the only reason why Canelo Alvarez lost that fight was just because of size. It was a combination of size and skill. But the point is that Dmitry Bivol was... it's hard to face a fighter that probably is bigger than you by about 2 or 1.5 weight classes. And then on top of that, they're like literally one of the top 5 pound-for-pound fighters in the world. It's almost impossible to do that.
Up at range and built on the disciplined Soviet style of boxing. And stylistically, he was perhaps the toughest opponent Canelo could have chosen at the higher weight.
I think people are sleeping on Bivol. I think it's going to be a great fight. I think Bivol can go in there. He's been waiting for this opportunity for a long, long time.
Normally, Canelo's speed and skill had been enough to offset the many size disadvantages at these higher weights. But on this...
Canelo had gained a little bit too much muscle mass for that fight. You could tell that he was a little bit yoked up for that fight the same way that he was against Kovalev, and it actually had worked against him because he had no stamina past round 4, literally none, which is why his back was up against the ropes for the latter part of the fight. He had no stamina whatsoever. He should have tried to retain a little bit of lighter stature. I don't know if it would have won him the fight anyway, but it would have definitely, been a lot better. And Canelo, I think, also fought the complete wrong strategy. Although it's the right strategy to pressure Bivol, in my personal view, he tried to bully him a little bit too much, and he didn't have enough of mid-range capabilities. After this fight, Canelo, I don't think, was ever really the same again. He never really looked at peak form ever again.
Occasion, Bivol responded with nimble movement, crisp combinations, and masterful control of distance. Canelo struggled to establish himself as the Russian swept the majority of the rounds, handing the Mexican the second defeat of his career.
Once again, Canelo was breathing so heavy in that fight. He was so exhausted. Canelo really almost had no chance to fight back because he had no stamina in the second half of that fight whatsoever.
For 3 years, Canelo had seamlessly moved between 3 divisions, collecting belts in each. And although a rematch clause was available, his team advised him to return to super middleweight, where he already reigned undisputed, and where the physical disadvantages were less pronounced.
Which, of course, was the right move. Many of the Canelo Alvarez haters, of course, were saying, well, why doesn't he rematch Bivol and all that stuff? Because they don't belong in the same ring together. And people will say, well, Bivol, of course, offered that fight at 168. How come Canelo wouldn't take that? Why? Because you guys were going to give Canelo Alvarez 100% credit if he fought Bivol to have 168. The point is that basically what the narrative would have been is that, if he fights Bivol at 168, if Canelo wins that fight, then you're just going to claim that Bivol was weight drained, and then if Canelo Alvarez loses that fight, then his career is basically done and never at the same level in his career ever again. So Canelo made the right decision.
Back at 168 pounds, he resumed control.
This, of course, was when he moved Gennady Golovkin up one weight class. Gennady, of course, was not the same fighter as what he once was. He was still about an A-grade level fighter, but he was nowhere near the same fighter as what he once was. He was still defeating fighters like Steve Rolls and that one Asian fighter. I believe he fought that one Japanese fighter, but he was not really the same fighter as what he once was. Nowhere near.
First came a decisive win over Gennady Golovkin to close out their trilogy, followed by dominant defenses against John Ryder, Jamal Charlo, Jaime Munguia, Edgar Berlanga, and William Sculls.
Jaime Munguia, in my personal view, was debatably an A- level win. Jamal Charlo, in my view, was an A- level win. He was someone that was debated as top 10 pound for pound by many. I didn't put him there personally, but I can understand if you did. He was someone that was undisputed at 154, and him and Canelo are both really middleweights. So that fight to me was very comparable to Mayweather versus Marquez. So that was his 10th A-grade level win in my personal view. And then when you take a look at Munguia, that one's kind of a debate. That one's a little bit of a debate. But Munguia, he did show a lot of great strides, especially with, Freddie Roach. He had just won a decision, a clear, close decision over Sergey Derevyanchenko. And he beat some other, experienced fighters as well. So Jaime Munguia was someone that, wasn't the most talented fighter in the world, but I think that he was around A-. He was someone that, overall was a legit A- level fighter that was starting to show great boxing strides and great overall boxing, maturity. So that's why I put it at A-. Now, if it would have been the same Munguia that had a problem like against someone Irish fighter, then yes, it would have been a B-grade level win. But this Munguia was someone overall that was a better fighter than what he once was. And John Ryder was someone that, definitely had a lot more wear and tear because of the Canelo fight. But it was the first time John Ryder was knocked out in a while. So I got to give Jaime Munguia a lot of credit there. But William Skull and Edgar Berlanga, although they were undefeated, they were not A-grade level fighters in my view. Certainly not Edgar Berlanga. But William Skull, I guess we'll have to see who he's able to beat. But just in my view, the way that I see it, I don't see him as an A-grade level fighter.
Ended in wide unanimous decisions, with Canelo rarely troubled. But
Munguia looked absolutely huge against Canelo Alvarez. Take a look at this shit. Size ain't even comparable. Like, Jesus fucking Christ.
Only due to the Mexican's brilliance have his recent challenges appeared less threatening. Between his 2018 victory over Golovkin and his 2021 undisputed crowning against Caleb Plant, fans have grown accustomed to record-breaking performances against naturally larger opponents.
Another body shot, and down goes Fielding.
And I agree with that. Canelo has fought naturally large opponents basically for a lot of the, the past 10 years. He basically was the same size as some of the guys that he fought at 155, or excuse me, at 154 and 155 when he had that little catch weight. And then at 160, he pretty much, from 160 onwards, he really was outsized by everybody, by every A-grade level fighter that he fought, except Miguel Cotto and Charlo.
Men with height and reach advantages across super middle and light heavy were dispatched by a fighter who began his rise as a welterweight. And even now, despite not recording a stoppage win in nearly 4 years, Canelo remains untouched. Across 3 entire divisions, no opponent has yet shown the tools to overcome his vast experience, exceptional ring IQ, and fight-changing power.
Gets the back and lands a big right.
With his legacy already cemented, each passing year brings fewer blockbuster showdowns worthy of Canelo Alvarez. Yet for his next assignment, the Mexican great has accepted a peculiar challenge. Terence "Bud" Crawford, a switch-hitting genius and 4-division world champion in his own right. Unlike Canelo's recent opponents, Crawford is not relying on size or strength. Having spent most of his career in lighter divisions, his leap across nearly 3 weight classes forces him to depend on pure skill, timing, and nuance.
And there's a right, and he goes down again.
For Canelo,
And of course, we're going to go through Crawford's resume as well, because I'm sure they have a video about Crawford as well.
it presents a puzzle unlike any he has faced in years. One that may demand the full depth of his craft, reaching back to the sharper, more intricate tools that first secured his success at light middleweight.
Conventional fighter, and there is Canelo. Oh, there it is, a third time.
And so, in a sport where true super fights have become rare, boxing once again finds itself on the cusp of something extraordinary.
Crawford's going to have to really make sure that he does not pull his hand away with that. So hopefully for Crawford, you know, he can learn overall how to defend that shot, but we'll see.
Two of the era's defining champions collide.
Because sometimes Crawford really loves to use that probing jab, and I have no doubt in my mind that Canelo Alvarez, that he's going to try to time that. Now, will he be able to do it successfully? We'll see on Saturday. But that's going to be a punch that Crawford really has to watch out for.
In a bout that will not only test Canelo's longevity, but also redefine what it means to be great in this generation.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. I just thought that video was very particularly interesting. But there we go. That's the video going through Canelo's resume once again. I give him 11 A-grade level wins in his career. The first one, obviously, Austin Trout. He beat Miguel Cotto, was undefeated. I think that's self-explanatory. The one after that, Sonny Lara, in my view, beat the shit out of Paul Williams, but got completely robbed. Paul Williams actually got a lot of bullshit decisions in his career, to be quite honest with you. The first one over Sergio Martinez, and also the one over Lara, to be quite honest with you. You know, and he probably got a couple others. But, you know, Lara was someone that defeated Austin Trout, in my view, defeated Paul Williams, and, you know, some other ones. He was an A-grade level fighter at his prime. After that, he defeated Miguel Cotto. Of course, Cotto was the WBC and the, you know, ring middleweight champion at the time. So, I mean, the point is that, yes, Cotto was still an A-grade level fighter. You know, not quite overall as young as what he once was, but still someone that was an athletically great fighter and someone that was more revived or more refurbished because of Freddie Roach. So, yes, that was an A-grade level win. All right, it is what it is. Then after that, Gennady Golovkin, A-grade level win. Once again, he still was at the peak of his career, knocked out a guy in Vadas Martirosyan in 2 rounds, a guy that gave Andrade, Lara, and Jermell Charlo all a tough fight, didn't get dropped against any of them, and gave them all a tough fight. Had a split decision, I believe, although probably should have been a unanimous decision loss, but had a split decision, I believe, against that of an Andrade. You know, had a draw against Lara in the first fight, although he probably should have lost that fight, and had a very tough fight with Jermell Charlo. Golovkin knocked that dude out in 2 rounds. Keep that in mind. All right, so it is what it is. So, yes, that was an A-grade level win. Then after that, of course, you know, Danny Jacobs, A-grade level win, coming off the win over Sergey Derevyanchenko, and not too long ago having a very competitive fight with Golovkin. You know, so Danny Jacobs, of course, deserves that. He also, of course, had the victories over Sergio Mora and the A-grade level fighter at the time, Peter Quillen. At least debatable A-grade level fighter, so that was his 5th. Then after that, of course, he fought Sergey the Crusher Kovalev, who, of course, you know, had his fair share of decent wins. And on top of that, had defeated 2 guys that were undefeated at the weight class. So, yes, that is, at least in my view, an A- level win. Then after that, of course, you know, Callum Smith, George Groves, you know, excuse me, of course, a great win. You know, that's an A- level win, in my view. Of course, the Joshua Buatsi fight, you know, recently, that shows you how good he still is. A- or A-grade level win, in my view. Billy Joe Saunders, once again, I've already went through his wins over Lemieux and Andy Lee and, what's his name? Chris Eubank Jr. and who all those guys defeated. So Billy Joe Saunders, you know, he defeated all of them quite clearly, other than Chris Eubank Jr. And that was a fight where Billy Joe Saunders was not at his absolute peak yet. That was in the early part of his career. But he beat Andy Lee and he beat David Lemieux very clearly. And those guys were legit, like, very solid B-plus level fighters. You know, Andy Lee, you could possibly even debate was A-, but I think I'd probably debate him B+. But the point overall is that I explained that. So that was his 7th A-grade level win. Or, excuse me, his 8th. Then the 9th one, of course, Caleb Plant, Jose Uzcategui, Caleb Truax. 2 guys that, you know, Jose Uzcategui was debatably an A- level fighter. He was someone that was a legit champion. Also a steroid user, by the way. But someone overall that knocked out one of the Durrell brothers, and Caleb Plant embarrassed him. Caleb Plant also gave David Benavidez a hell of a fight, 7 rounds to 5 or 8 rounds to 4, in my personal view. So Caleb Plant was at least an A- or A grade level fighter. So that was the 9th A grade level win in his career. Then, of course, Jamel Charlo, in my personal view, completely undisputed at 154. They were really both middleweight fighters. That's at least an A- level win. And, of course, Jaime Munguia got the wins over Sergey Derevyanchenko and then was the first one to knock out John Ryder in years, although John Ryder definitely suffered some wear and tear from the Canelo fight. But Sergey Derevyanchenko, in my view, actually was not as washed up as what certain people tried to say that he was. He actually was still a solid B grade level fighter. He's another example of a guy that can give a lot of A grade level fighters a tough fight, but he's never going to be a guy that wins the title, at least more than likely. That's what he is, which is why every time he steps up, he loses. But it is what it is. So, yes, all those wins, in my view, A- to A+, in my view. You can maybe take out the Munguia win, but other than that, in my view, I think the rest are clear A-grade level wins. But in my view, even Munguia was a A- level win in my personal view. But anyways, because his boxing intelligence and strides and skill had clearly shown strides. But anyways, that being stated, that pretty much is about it for the Canelo fight, or overall his resume. We're going to do Terrence Bud Crawford next, assuming, of course, that the Ring Magazine did that, but I just thought that I would talk about that. But that's it for Canelo Alvarez's resume. Next, we'll do Terrence Bud Crawford. Hopefully, y'all enjoy. This is very nostalgic for me, as I'm sure it was for some of you as well. But anyways, that's really about it. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.